Welcome to Right in the West podcast. Our guest this week is Johnny D. Boggs, 10-time Spur Award winner and winner of the Western Heritage Wrangler Award. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Tyler Offhammer with Cowboys and Indians Magazine, and we have the pleasure of having with us Johnny D. Boggs, a Western Heritage and Spur Award winning author of books like Legacy of a Lawman, 1,000 Texas Longhorns, and his latest Spur Award winner, Bloody Newton. Johnny, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So you've written more westerns, I think, than anyone working today. What first drew you all those years ago to the western genre?
I grew up in South Carolina, and I said, you grow up in the tobacco fields and pine forests and swamps. When you're watching TV and the westerns were on, I said, wow, that's pretty cool. I mean, I can see something that's not like I'm in a tunnel. And so I was just kind of captivated by that, and always, and even through college. So I majored in journalism, and I applied at every newspaper west of the Mississippi River. And the Dallas Times Herald just happened to be hiring a bunch of young, college graduates to expand their zone suburban coverage, and I got hired as a sports writer. So I was out west, kind of, and started writing on the side. I had a few short stories published, and at some point, well, the Herald folded. The Times Herald folded the day after uh, my fiance and I moved into our first house. So, so that kind of burns you out a little bit on newspaper journalism. But I got a job at the Fort Worth Star Telegram. But by 1998, I was thinking, I'm freelancing a little bit on the side. I had some books published, not for big advances or anything like that. But I said, maybe I can just go out west and farther west to New Mexico. And so I just kind of randomly told my wife, I said, why don't we sell the house? We moved to New Mexico, Santa Fe. You get a job and I'll stay home and write full time. And somehow she thought that was a really good idea.
Well, it sounds like from pretty early on you had a pull to move west.
Right.
Like a lot of the characters in your books and in Western fiction. And were there any early TV or film influences for you? Any actors or films that really inspired you?
Well, my dad was a big fan of Gunsmoke, and it
Oh
was
yeah.
on at 9 o'clock on Monday nights on the East Coast, and we he would ritually watch that, and I'd watch it with him. So yeah, Gunsmoke was probably the big one. I never really cared that much for Bonanza,
Yeah.
but I always thought, the Virginian. Well, sometimes they actually work cattle, and the Cartwrights, they hardly ever work cattle. So, well, what are they doing? So, so that was an influence. And I remember I went into a bookstore once, and I just found it's kind of oversized hardcover called The American West, and I bought it, and literally I read that book over and over until it fell apart. And that taught me, hey, this TV and these movies, they're not really getting all this stuff the way it actually happened. And I said, if I was going to write this stuff, I'd rather make it a little more realistic and less kind of Hollywoodish.
Well, and speaking of, that true West history, you've written on a wide range of topics from Billy the Kid to cattle drives to Civil War conflicts. How do you go about deciding which stories and which what the atmosphere is going to be in those stories?
Well, the Kensington, my editor just retired, but he was pretty high on the cattle drives. So he had actually the first one he asked me to do was he called me up and said, I want a sequel to Borden Chase's novel that became the movie Red River. And I was like, well, Gary, you've been in the business long enough. You ought to know something about copyright. And he says, we think it's fallen out of copyright. The novel has fallen out of copyright, so it's fair game. And I said, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, it's easy enough. I mean, you just have Matthew Garth. He's got to make another big cattle drive to save the ranch. He goes, well, we'll think about that, but I got to turn it over to legal. And that took, you know, months. But he finally called me back and said, yeah, we've got the clearances out of copyright, so it's all fair game. So that was an intriguing idea.
Right.
But you're taking characters that were created by somebody else. Now, it's one thing to write about real people,
Right.
but this was a little different. So that was kind of a challenge, I think, and it won a Spur Award. So
Yeah.
and that got him happy. He said, "Let's do another one," and it won a Spur Award. He said, "Let's do another one." Did another one. So I've been on cattle drives. But the great thing about cattle drives is you're not stuck in one place, and it's always a journey, and it's a journey for a physical journey. You're going from wherever to wherever, but it's also a journey of how the characters mature, and that kind of appealed to me on that. So I'm always drawn by the characters first.
Yeah, and I'm sure as an author, it's a difficult task to balance what actually happened with the research that you're doing into the history, and obviously you have to take some creative license at some point along the way. And um, how much of your work ends up being your own inventions, and obviously your characters are a big part of that, but is that something you consciously approach of, okay, I got to get this right, or I could take a little leeway with something else?
It's I think it probably depends on project to project,
Yeah.
but you do. I mean, I am a I have gotten letters or calls from descendants of these people.
Wow.
So and you think about that, you are dealing with real people. I mean,
Right.
even if they've been dead for 50 or 100 years, they were
Yeah.
real people, and they have fans and they have enemies, and so you have to figure that out. So I always I actually years ago I had a historian call me, and I had written a book, and he discovered this. I had this letter, I think, and he called me and says, I'm just reading this their novel here, and you got this letter. Where'd you find that? I had to say, I appreciate that, but I made it up.
He was interested.
Yeah. So hey,
Poor
and
guy.
he said, well, you really got the vernacular spot on of how a letter would have been written in the 1870s.
That's right. That's really
Okay.
cool.
Yeah, that was a great compliment, I thought.
Are you a big Western fiction reader? And if so, do you find that you have to consciously stick to your own voice, or at this point, is it just kind of easy for you to be influenced and to be inspired, but once you start, you're Johnny Boggs?
Yeah. There's that. I mean, Lauren D. Esselman, who's written them, he's probably best known for mysteries, the Amos Walker mystery series, and thrillers and things like that. But he's written a number. He's got 5 Spur Awards, and I met him, and he said, a lot of people say they won't read a western because they don't want to be influenced, a western novel, and he
Right.
says, what's wrong with being influenced by something that's good? I mean, if you're reading Elmer Kelton, if you're reading a Lauren D. Esselman, I mean, you're going to be influenced by that writing, but you're being influenced by good writing.
Right.
So he said, "There's nothing wrong with that," and he also said, "I'm writing all the time. If,
Yeah.
if, why can't I read a western?" So yeah, I do read a number of westerns, and I read mysteries and thrillers and
Are there any authors that you keep returning to the well for inspiration,
uh,
especially in the Western genre, I guess?
yeah. Well, I mean, the Western genre is kind of shrinking. That's one thing we're seeing a lot. But yeah, I'll read anything written by Lauren Esselin, and there are a number of great writers out there
Right.
now, and probably some of them don't quite get the attention they deserve. I mean,
Right.
and I'm a member of Western Writers of America, so I'm hanging out. I mean, convention's coming up next no in June, and I'll hang out with them, and it's a great thing. I mean, writers. Here I am alone in the office, and
Right.
that's where I spend most of my year. But you go out and you meet people who are doing the same thing, and we talk about craft, and we talk about what we're working on, and
Right.
problems we're seeing, and the future of the industry, and things like that. So it's a good little uh, few days to go and
Definitely.
hang out with other people that are doing the same thing. But yeah, I'll read Esselman. Those. Sandra Dallas, I like. There's a short story writer out of Nashville. She's mostly a songwriter named Nikki Fernan. She writes fiction under Vaughn McKee. I think she's really talented. and I read a lot of nonfiction too. I mean, it's great stuff. And like I said, I'll read Hampton Sides. I'll read Preston Lewis. Read David Morrell, thriller writer. A lot of his old books, and actually David Morrell, uh, two other writers here in Santa Fe named Tom Claggett and Robert Knott, who've written books, and Tom's written some novels. And there's and Kirk Ellis, who's an Emmy Award screenwriter of John Adams fame, and then recently the Franklin miniseries. And we hang out, and we every once and coming up this Sunday, we have what we call the movie club, Western movie night, and we'll go and just talk shop, and then we'll watch a Western movie. David
That's cool.
Morrell's turns this turn. So yeah, that's fun. So yeah,
Yeah,
there is a community of writers, and we do bounce ideas off each other.
that's great. Well, and speaking of your office, can you talk us through your typical writing process? I mean, you're fairly prolific. Is there a set schedule? Are you somebody that kind of lets the story unfold for you? How does that work?
I First of all, I have to have the idea and
Right.
whatever I'm writing, and once all that's settled, um, either by the editor or the editor and me, or just me if I'm writing something on spec. Um, for a book, I'll have or even for a short story, I'll have an outline. I come up with what I want to do, and then I figure out who I want to tell the story, and do I want to tell it? How do I want to tell it? Third person, first person, limited point of view, or multi point of view, and that depends on what the book's about. And once I figure that out, then I do all the research, or as much research as I can, and then I write down a little really minimalistic outline, and I start writing. And then you realize that the outline's not going to work. You realize that other things aren't going to work. You make changes, but I have a beginning point, and I know where I think the book's going to end. And sometimes the beginning changes, and sometimes the end. But I've always said, people will argue that an outline isn't good. You should just write, stream of consciousness or whatever. Uh, and I've realized that when you do that, you get I read a lot of books, and I said this really doesn't have anything to do with the plot. You could have lost these 10 whole pages, and you wouldn't have heard anything. But if you follow an outline so rigorously, it becomes predictable. And then if you're predictable, you're going to lose your reader. So mine's always a loose outline, and I realize, this outline isn't working. This doesn't work either, or this character is a lot bigger than I thought this character was going to be,
Right.
or this character isn't as bad as I thought he or she was going to be. So it's a loose outline, and it's changing constantly. And then I write, and then I go back and I rewrite until finally people ask me, when do you know it's finished? And I said, what's my deadline? And I've told this story often. It's true. I was
Yeah.
working on a magazine piece once, and the editor of the magazine called me up and says, hey, Johnny, I'm just checking in because, your article's due today. And I said, it's still today. By my understanding of this contract, I have until 11:59 p.m. to file it.
Oh, I
They
bet he
caught
loved
on to me, and then they started putting manuscript will be delivered at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time
it.
at such and such a day.
Well, that sounds like your journalistic past coming back of taking every last ounce you could.
Right.
Do you think in some ways, your career as a journalist influenced your career as a fiction
Oh,
writer?
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the one thing journalism, newspaper journalists especially, taught you is you hit your deadline. That's the
yeah,
main, first and foremost. You don't want to miss the final edition at all. So deadlines are very important. The other thing it teaches you is there are at least two sides to every story, and you need to get both sides of those stories, and then you need to dig farther and farther. And you also have to realize that what somebody is telling you is that's one person's memory or one person's vision, and vision and memory are all different. So get as many sides to the story as possible, and then you try to sort out what is the truth. So yeah, I mean, I've always approached my craft as writing fiction as an actual journalist.
well, and speaking of, those multifaceted stories, you also have some pretty complex characters too throughout your books, and it's in a lot of ways a far cry from, the early Hollywood days of the white hat hero and the black hat villain. And these are pretty morally, gray characters. What about those titans of characters draws you to them?
because they aren't wearing white hats and they aren't just necessarily wearing black hats. I mean, and something drives them to
Yeah.
where they are. I mean, one moment can change your whole life, and
Right.
that's something I'm always thinking about. And actually, John Chandler was a friend of mine, a singer songwriter mostly up in Denver, and he had read Longhorns East, which is the novel that came out before Bloody Newton, and he just raved about it. I kind of appreciate. Thanks, John. But he's saying, the thing is, I mean, this bad guy really isn't all that bad, and his good guy isn't really all that good, and some of the supporting players are just stars on their own. So he's writing about real people and not black hat versus white hat, good versus evil.
Well, and the thing I love too is that the bad guy doesn't always think he's bad, and the good guy doesn't always think he's good either.
Yeah, yeah.
They have to be convinced by the end of the book. Well, and speaking of some of your stories, are there any particular characters you've written that tend to linger through? And obviously, I think you've done some stories that include uh, characters and how do you usually deal with that? If you want to return to a character,
Hmm. Well, usually I really don't like writing series. I've done
right,
a few, but I really
right,
don't
right,
because I want to get I get tired of them.
yeah.
And actually, someone actually told me, he said, they were creating a series and said by the third book, I was sick of them all. I wanted to kill them all off, but the publisher wouldn't let me. Uh, but I approach characterizations a lot, just as an actor would, and then even in the scenes. And I studied a lot of acting in college. Not a, I've been on theater a couple of times here, and what I really I always said what I really loved was theater was being an audition reader, where I got to play all the parts, and at the end of the day, I'm going home happy,
Yeah,
and everybody else is going home, who are actually auditioning for the role or going home throwing up, or saying, "Oh my God, why didn't I play it this way?" But you, theater or acting, it teaches you what's the character's motivation, and I always think about that. I mean, and even he's going in, okay, he's going into the bar saloon. Why is he going into the saloon? Is it just because it's hot? Is he going in because he's a drunk? Is he going in? He just wants one beer, or is he going in to kill somebody? I mean, so you figure all that. What's the motivation and things like that. So that's how I approach the characterizations. But continuing characters, usually I said, the book's over and I'm done with these people. And then the next book, I want to do something about somebody who's completely different than what I just wrote about.
do you think it's the result of a lot of curiosity about different
Yeah,
parts of
yeah,
history and
yeah,
different
yeah. And then
opportunities?
you know, to say what are you going to write next? And I have a list. I mean, of a list of ideas, and
Yeah,
right now they're just an idea, maybe just a title. Maybe I'll read something and say that's a good title,
right,
or I see a name and I say I want to use that name and things like that. But so I'll never be able to finish everything on the list. But so I
right.
have to pick and choose and say, okay, this is going to be the last book you ever write. What do you want it to be?
That's right. Well, I'd love to take just a pivot for a second and talk about the Western genre and Westerns in general, aside from your own stories. And, you know, having been prolific in the genre for a number of years now, and what do you think really defines a great Western novel? I think that's changed, since Lonesome Dove and
Right.
these Zane Greys and in today's world, what are the readers looking for a great Western novel?
I think a lot of them, well, you're finding more, um, most of the readers, most of the book buyers, and even when I'm at a book signing, most of the people I'm selling a book to or signing a book for are women.
Ah,
So that's changed a lot. And the editors, the last few books, he says you need to have a strong woman character.
right.
And for Bloody Newton, he said, could you give us two strong women
Wow. Yeah.
characters? Because I mean that's who's reading the book. So you're seeing. I mean, it used to be almost exclusively male, older male,
Right.
seriously older or male readers. And at book signings, a lot of times when the women were buying the books, they said, "This is for my grandfather, this is for
Hmm.
my husband, this is for my father." So they're still reading. But yeah, usually when the women were buying the books, they'd also are having me sign it. They said, "And I'll probably wind up reading it too." So that's the one big change you're seeing, and you're seeing more women writers. And it
Right.
used to be that a woman writer would have to write under a pseudonym.
Right.
Dorothy M. Johnson was probably a big exception. And we're seeing a lot of really good women writers. I mean, Sandra Dallas,
Right.
who I mentioned. I mean, she's a great writer, and she's writing westerns, but primarily from the woman's point of view, and
Right.
sometimes from a children's point of view. She's writing a lot of middle grade readers and young adult novels too. And that's what I've always, when I started writing some young adults, I mean, my agent said, "You're making a big mistake," and I said, "Well, the thing is, if we don't start approaching and getting younger readers hooked on westerns, we're not going to have any readers alive, 20 or 30 years from now." And later, because I had some success with the YAs, he said, and he never said this. He says, "I was wrong. You were right." So we're seeing a lot more people approaching the young adult market or the middle grade market, and that's
Right.
great because
Right.
the future of the Western depends on the kids growing up now, and you've got
Right.
to figure out a way to reach those.
Well, and I think there definitely was a pretty long history where Westerns were dismissed as pulp or genre fiction. And do you think that that stigma has changed or is changing or has stayed the same?
I think it depends on who you ask, but I think a lot of people still think, oh, westerns. You're talking about Louis L'Amour or
Right.
like you said, Zane Grey, and if you look on the New York Times and USA Today bestseller list on the mass market paperback, which is also failing or
Right.
fading away pretty quickly, but mass market paperbacks, you're always going to see William Johnstone,
Right.
J.A. Johnstone on that list. So those are reading. Those are still popular among
Right.
this certain section of the crowd. But at the same time, you need to reach out ahead of that market or some to other markets. And that's a great thing that C.J. Boggs
Right.
and Craig Johnson and Anna Hillerman are doing. They're writing westerns, and
Right.
they're writing about men and women with badges and guns who are bringing law and order to the West. But it's the contemporary West, and
Correct.
the contemporary West, I think, is you're seeing a big expansion in the genre there. But they're still westerns.
Right. Well, and you brought up a great point. We see that in film and television right now too, with the Taylor Sheridan series of Yellowstone, 1883, you name it, all the different years, and the old Henry movie, which came out a couple of years ago, which is I think really different compared to a lot of other westerns, and
Yeah.
you know. I almost have to assume that a lot of that shift toward these contemporary style westerns and I love to call them like gritty western, gritty
Right.
realism. With the rise of technology, in today's world, and do you think there's still a place for these traditional westerns of, six shooters and horses, and are you seeing that community stay stagnant or is it growing at all?
Uh, I don't know if it's growing, but it's still holding its own a little bit.
Yeah,
But you're seeing some literary westerns come out
right.
and things like, and talking about Taylor Sheridan, I think Wind River and what was the other one?
Hell or
Hell
High
or High
Water.
Water. Hell
Yeah,
or High Water. Those
yeah,
are two of the best westerns I've seen on theaters in a long time.
right.
I mean, you watched Kevin Costner's latest, and I was like, man, what were you thinking? Uh, you kind of
It's a tough market.
missed the mark there. Yeah, yeah.
I don't think since Open Range, a real traditional Western has really captured me
No,
in
no,
that way.
no. Right.
We're still waiting, and in the meantime, we'll have to rely on our Western writers. Um, and the thing I've seen, especially in my own writing and speaking to other writers, is one of the difficult parts of the traditional Western in particular is there's not a lot of publishing houses that are doing it right now. And Kensington, I think a Five Star is doing quite a bit, and then you have some smaller houses. What have you seen in that regard, especially just being in the industry like you are?
Yeah. When I started writing in started really getting published a lot. There were a number, and we talked about mass market paperbacks, and you know, booksellers don't like those because it's not as good of a profit margin.
Right.
So those are starting to fade away, and those were the big. I mean, the mainstay of Western started out with the smaller mass market paperbacks, and
Right.
and Western Writers of America just this is the last they're awarding a best original paperback novel this year, and this is going to be the last one because
Wow.
they're just not getting the entries because publishers don't want to publish them anymore,
Right.
booksellers don't want to sell them anymore. So that's a big change there, and
Right.
what's that's going to and the mass market was always the home of the traditional Western, the more Louis L'Amour,
Phantom
Yates,
and all of those
yeah,
houses. Yeah.
Phantom, and those were doing that. So that's a big change there. And so what's going to happen? You know, readers' tastes change,
Right.
and the industry changes, and you've
Yep.
got to adapt with these changes if you're a writer and if you're
Yeah.
trying to make a living doing this. So
And
that's
I
something
and
we're all facing.
And I think the platform style too, a lot of people are listening to audiobooks or, like we're doing right now, listening to podcasts about
Right,
books
right,
and
right.
obviously TV and film. But I think in a lot of ways, there's still, as you're saying, a healthy appetite for the West, for traditional Westerns. And, you know, having written so many, what do you think resonates with people still, even in 2025 with the Western?
The openness
Yeah.
or that. I mean, I think people like the scenery.
Yeah.
That's always a big part. And I always said, the land in westerns especially, the land is always a character. And sometimes it's a hero, and sometimes it's really not. And we still face that today. I mean, with the fires, and blizzards. I mean, it can be a tough place to live even today, and you're seeing a lot of that. So that's one of the great appeals for Western, even today. And even Tony Hillerman was great at description,
Of
and
course.
yeah, he was a master of that. Just a
Well,
wonderful person. But yeah, so I think we're seeing some of that. But there's still being westerns published. I mean,
right.
Paula Giles is still writing westerns, and we're seeing a lot of more. Elizabeth Crook. Uh, so we're still getting some really good. But we're seeing, like I said, Elizabeth Crook, Sandra Dallas. You're seeing a lot more women writers, and we need that
Yeah,
to bring more women readers into the genre.
exactly. Well, and I think the thing that appeals to a lot of people too, and you mentioned this before, was you can have a romance story,
Yeah,
but it's under the umbrella of a Western, or you can have a mystery story, but it's there's so many different facets to it
right,
that people
right,
can connect with.
right. One of my favorite westerns. Uh, I interviewed John Jakes years and years ago when
Oh
he was,
yeah.
over
North and
Western
South,
War.
right?
Yeah, yeah, North and South. But he told me that he had written a science fiction novel back when he was writing just anything. I mean, he was writing
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
But he said he written a science fiction novel called Six Gun Planet, and it's about a planet that forms its whole community around you know B westerns and
Wow.
dime novels and things
That's
like
cool.
that. Yeah, so I mean, the western really grows, and everybody says Star Wars was a space western, and it
Yeah,
was.
that's true.
And someone asked me, "What's a western?" I said, "Everything's a western.
It
It's
is.
all western."
That's right. Well, and you mentioned the landscape and how important in every Western the landscape is,
Right.
and you're in a prime spot in New Mexico, for inspirational landscapes. And how has that influenced you living in that area? And have you done much traveling throughout the years to find more inspiration?
Oh yeah, I travel all the time. I mean,
Yeah,
I love a good road trip.
yeah,
Nothing like that. And I think we also define the westerns. I mean, I've gone back to South Carolina, my home state, and I've written westerns that were set in South Carolina because I always said, the frontier hasn't always just been west of the Mississippi.
right,
The frontier starts when the first European settlers settle on it. Or you look at Michael and Kathy Gear. They've written the even pre-contact westerns about the natives living here before there was a white
right.
influence. So yeah, everything's a western.
Definitely, definitely. And is speaking of, you've gotten your history fix with some of these stories set in the Civil War, and obviously you have your more traditional, lawman outlaw westerns, and then some that hit close to home with South Carolina
Right.
influence. And is there a novel or a story that is especially, that you're especially proud of? And what was one that was really difficult to write?
None comes easy.
Right.
Um, Gosh, I think the one that came out before, Longhorns East, which is based on history. And actually, the editor called me up and says, "Do you have anything in mind?" I said, "Well, got it. I've got it." In 1850s, there was this cattleman who actually learned the business in England, and he migrated to the United States. He settled in Illinois in early to mid 1850s. He went down to Texas and drove cattle to New York City.
Wow.
It was a cattle drive from Texas to New York City. Before there were cattle drives became really well known as what we think of them today as trail drives in Kansas.
Right.
And he said, "I don't think that'll sell in Peoria." And I said, "Well, okay, I can come up," and that's where I came up with Bloody Newton.
Ah,
And the next day he called me back and says, "I've been rethinking that, and maybe it will sell in Peoria. Maybe it will sell a lot of other places too, because this is off the charts. I mean,
right.
we don't see westerns about cattle drives in New York City." So he
Mm-mm.
says, "Yeah, go for it." And it was Longhorns East,
Wow.
uh, and yeah, so I wrote that, and I was going to open it with a little prologue um, in London before he heads to America. It was going to be like, I figured, I'll give it 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 words. It became a quarter of the book
Yeah.
because I got so fast. You know what? Hey, people know about cattle drives. I mean, they know
Right.
what's going to happen on that, but no one knows what's going on in England in the 1840s. And this is where, Scott, the cattle original cowboys are actually, from the Scottish Highlands driving cattle into markets in London. So I said, this is something I really want to expand on. And kind of,
Wow.
and I didn't go to England to do the research, but I
Right.
read a lot about that. So
Wow.
that was a challenge. A lot of people,
Yeah.
and the main characters from England. I mean, how's an Englishman going to really adapt to life on the frontier at what time was Ohio and Illinois? And then I created some bad guys who turned out to be not so bad. So it was a fun book to write, but it was a very big challenge to write that kind of book.
Well, and you brought up a
And
great point, whether it be writing an Englishman or someone from another country or a female character, how do you really put yourself in the mindset of these kind of almost foreign bodies, of people that, you really want to capture the authentic voice of? Is it a
right,
lot of research?
it's a lot of research, and then
Yeah.
let's say it's a combination of research and imagination. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who disagree, but I've been complimented quite often on the female characters and say, "How can you do that?" And I said, "Well, I got two sisters. I had a mother, two grandmothers. I have a lot of close women friends. I mean, it's, that's what you're doing. I'm pulling what I know from these other people. In
Right.
the same way, I mean, I don't know that many villains. I know some people I don't like. That list might be growing these days, uh, but I pull from people I actually know. And I always said, a lot of times what I've done when I first started writing, I remember one of the first short stories I ever published. I mailed home. And it wasn't Western. It was Southern kind of autobiographical little story. And I remember my mama talking about it. And I remember me saying to myself, "You want to keep getting invitations back for Thanksgiving and Christmas, you might want to not ever send one of your Southern stories back home." And I didn't. So,
Then you switch
uh,
to fiction.
but I realized that I can take all these people I knew in South Carolina that I grew up with, and I can put them in these Western settings because a lot of people from the South migrated to West
Right.
and write about them, and they won't even know it's about them because they're wearing cowboy hats and not a gimme
Right.
cow.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the characters are always kind of I pull them from people I've met, people I've known, or people I've just researched the heck out of.
Right.
And
Well, and I'm sure I'd love to ask you a quick second about the role of your editor and publisher, and I'm sure for a beginning writer who's just starting out, it's such a intimate experience to write their book all their own. And then of course the difficult work comes with trying to find a publisher for it when it's
Right.
unsolicited. At this point in your career, what does that relationship look like? I'm sure that, as you mentioned prior, that you have ideas, sometimes your editor has ideas, and what's that process look like once that idea has been solidified?
Once it's done, and you do your best, you hit your deadline, you hit your word count. That's the main
Right.
thing. You turn in the best story you possibly can, then you wait to see how bad you ruined it. And then that you get the first edits back, and then you see how badly you ruined it, and then you go through that, and you okay the changes, or you see how they what they've done. And as an editor, I've told this many times. I said, as an editor, I've never lost an argument to a writer. And as a writer, I've never lost an argument to an editor, or never
Yeah.
won an argument
Oh,
against an
one,
editor.
yeah.
Right. So yeah, editors know what they're doing, and most of the time, I'm okay with the changes they make.
Right.
And if it's not, I explain why.
Yeah.
Uh, and the editors are usually, especially in the westerns, they're usually very young, almost mostly of them are women who actually know a lot about the West too. I'm not
Right.
knocking that, but I think the youngness or stuff like that. And sometimes they'll make a change. The only time I've ever really gotten angry at a change was when I was, as a former copy editor and a former copy desk chief and assistant sports editor running the copy desk at two newspapers, was when I said, "Oh, wait a minute, you just changed this into a dangling participle. You can't do that." So you can't make this change, editor. So I changed it back. I said, no, 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 no. And I said, okay, it was a slip. And then
Yeah.
a few pages, maybe a couple of chapters later, I said, oh no, you did that again. Two dangling participles. No, 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 no. You can't make that kind of grammatical error
Right.
if you're an editor. But I didn't even explain. I just said, okay, I'm going to fix this one too. I didn't complain to the editor or anything like that because they've got
Oh my gosh,
a
yeah.
thankless job. I mean, you're reading
Yeah.
manuscripts over, and you've got a deadline, and you got all these books to read. So no, I'm not going to complain about it. But it did say, "Ooh, no, 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 don't do that." I mean, I can ruin a book enough on my own. I don't need your help.
Well, and you've brought up a number of times that you have it's an intimidating publishing industry these days, especially for Western authors, who are trying to break into that industry, and there's not a lot of places like there once was to get these stories, especially the unsolicited ones out there. What advice would you give to younger writers who want to break in, especially in the Western industry?
Just keep trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to keep trying. I think people now think I'm this overnight success, but I got a bunch of rejections, and I got
Yeah.
yeah, you don't have a chance in this market field. Why don't you go back to work in newspapers? I'm glad I didn't do that, but yeah, it's tough, and it's tough now. But there are more and more publishers, online publishers popping up. I've never done self-publishing, and I think I never will because I'm a terrible salesperson.
Yeah.
I know what I can do, and I can write a good story sometimes, and sometimes I can write a mediocre story. But selling is really that needs to be out of my hands because I said, I wrote this book, and part of it's good, part of it stinks, but whatever. But you just have to keep trying, and you never. I said all it takes, you know, my opinion does it when they ask me for a blurb. I say, okay, or an endorsement, or say, can you
Right.
help me? I said, my opinion really doesn't matter. Only two opinions matter: yours and the person who has the authority to give you a contract. And that's the only two people you have to please.
Right.
And it's easy to please one of them sometimes. It's harder to please others. So you just have to keep trying. And I
Yeah.
did not give up. I got rejected and rejected and rejected. And I just said, I think I could do this. And finally, I had a publisher that said, okay. And once you get that one credit or one book out, then other publishers will say, well, they saw something in this. I don't know what they saw because reading this manuscript, but maybe there is something here. So it's really a it's not. I think everybody has a story they can tell, and it's probably a pretty good story. But most people don't have the persistence to actually put that down in paper. And then once they've got it in paper and edited and to a place where they really like it, most of them don't have the persistence to keep trying to get that thing published. And I understand that too, because you get rejected and rejected and rejected. You start thinking, okay, but at some point you might land with a publisher who says, yeah, or an editor who thinks, hey, you know what, I kind of like this. Maybe we should take a chance on this person, and that's all it takes.
Right.
But it can be a long, hard journey. And like I say, there's no such thing as job security in this business, and it's a ever changing business, and you're at the whims of what is selling at the time, and those change too. And maybe at some point we'll see westerns really come back. Who
Right.
knows?
Exactly. Well, we've had a great 45-minute conversation with you, Johnny. I'd love to know, as my final question, what do you have coming up in the pipeline as far as your own work? And I know you also mentioned you'll have a busy summer with the conferences coming up
Right.
and all of that. What can your readers look forward to in 2025?
I don't know. I really don't know. I got to talk to my editor. It probably won't be 2025. It might be
Okay.
2026. But I have been asked, and I've been asked to contribute two short stories to anthologies. And the only time I ever write short stories these days, because they're harder to write than novels, is when someone asks me, says, "Will you write a story?" Something like that. So I've got this. One's actually to help U.S. Marshals. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and our law enforcement. And the other one is just he's putting together an anthology, and he's done a lot of short story anthologies. And I said, sure, down one of those. But now I got to think about, oh man, what am I going to write about this?
Now the work begins.
And I've got a few more ideas for novels. So when I go to pick up the spur, the editor's coming down, so maybe I'll be. And she's new. That's the first time I'll be working with her. If she wants to work with me,
Yeah.
so we'll see and see if she's got any ideas or if I can sell her some ideas that I have.
That's great. Well, in the meantime, Bloody Newton is available, and it's good so far. I've already made a little bit of a chunk out of it myself, and um, we're anxious to see what comes out of the desk next. And thank you again for taking the time to talk about westerns and your career. And we look forward to hearing from you next time.
Sounds great. Appreciate it.
All right, Johnny. Thank you, and take
All
care.
right.